线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Straight Talk with Xiangyu, where we talk all things Taiwan related and share perspectives not typically covered by mainstream media. So after my interview with Slava, I traveled to the Chinese mainland on somewhat of a business trip, specifically to the cities of Shenyang, Dandong, and Yanji. I'm not exactly at liberty to divulge what kind of project I'm working on yet, but if you look on a map and find where these three cities are, you might have an idea as to what it relates to. But when the time comes, you'll definitely find out from me. So that's what I've been busy with, and on top of that, as I was brainstorming episodes for this show, I came down with a very bad cold that I recovered from, but then I got an even worse cold and coughed so much that the area around my ribs started hurting. And hence the delay in this episode coming out. So I do apologize for the lack of updates over the last month. And before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude towards my incredible upper-level patrons, Alvin Zhao, Wang Yijing, Michael Kim, Victor, CD14039, Jim Fox, Kabasa Fogo, SCY, Maddie Roxy, and Thomas Siegel. Thank you all so much for going above and beyond to support the show. Your contributions help me dedicate more time to pursuing this passion project, and I truly appreciate it. So today, we'll be discussing a familiar but important question. Will the U.S. defend Taiwan's administration in the event of war? For as long as I've been speaking publicly in English, my answer has been no. And I've held this view even longer back when I was only sharing my political views in Chinese to my audience here in Taiwan. People on the anti-China side have dismissed my view as wishful thinking, while many Western commentators on the pro-China side seem to have an alarmist view of the situation and think of the Taiwan administration's relationship with the U.S. as akin to the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv, when the reality is the U.S. has thrown the Taipei administration under the bus on multiple occasions. Today, there's growing acknowledgement among U.S. foreign policy experts and advisors that the best course of action in the event of war is for the U.S. to not get too involved militarily. And this conversation is becoming more open, more frequent, and more serious. Recently, an article titled "The Taiwan Fixation" was published in Foreign Affairs, which is a journal on U.S. foreign policy, published by the Council of Foreign Affairs. This publication has all sorts of views, but they generally don't deviate from the Washington consensus. The two authors of this particular article are Jennifer Kavanagh and Stephen Wertheim. These two belong to a think tank called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which, while known to favor diplomatic engagement over hawkish foreign policy, nonetheless defends U.S. hegemony. Jennifer Kavanagh is an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and it's a known fact that Georgetown has deep ties with the U.S. foreign policy establishment, including the State Department, CIA, and other intelligence agencies. She's also the director of military analysis at Defense Priorities, so her job is to take the military situation into consideration when making her political analyses. Given the background of these two authors, we're hearing an analysis from people that are definitely not on the pro-China side of things. So regardless of our takeaways from their opinions, we cannot say that this is Chinese propaganda. Taiwan separatists on the ground have long felt emboldened by the false belief that the United States supports their cause, that in the event of war, the U.S. would come to Taiwan's rescue. But my argument has always been this: the U.S. supports the spread of separatist ideology only to the extent that it complicates Chinese reunification, not to the point where it would require putting real skin in the game. For years, separatists have dismissed this perspective as Communist Party propaganda designed to demoralize the public in Taiwan. But that dismissal doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Many people in Taiwan have been misled into thinking that the U.S. is obligated to defend Taiwan because of the Taiwan Relations Act. But the Taiwan Relations Act is a unilateral U.S. policy. It is not a mutual defense treaty signed by Washington and Taipei, and nowhere in the text does it guarantee U.S. military intervention in a cross-strait conflict. Then there's the belief that the U.S. would intervene out of goodwill because Taiwan spends roughly $1 billion annually on overpriced and often outdated American weapons. That number is going up to $2.2 billion this year. So, to clear my name and back up my position, I'll turn to the analysis of two staunch defenders of U.S. hegemony, neither of whom has any incentive to echo Beijing's talking points. Also, this is not a paid promo, but I hate paywalls, and although a lot of times you can get around them by temporarily disabling JavaScript on your browser, there's an easier way, which is to go to a website called textfrom.website. You can enter the link to the articles you're trying to read, and most of the time it'll successfully extract the entire article, which is how I got a hold of this article I'm about to talk about. So this article begins with the following paragraph. The fate of Taiwan keeps American policymakers up at night, and it should. A Chinese invasion of the island would confront the United States with one of its gravest foreign policy choices ever. Letting Taiwan fall to Beijing would dent Washington's credibility and create new challenges for U.S. military forces in Asia. But the benefits of keeping Taiwan free would have to be weighed against the costs of waging the first armed conflict between great powers since 1945. Even if the U.S. prevailed, and it might well lose, an outright war with China would likely kill more Americans and destroy more wealth than any conflict since the Vietnam War and perhaps since World War II. Nuclear and cyber weapons could make it worse, bringing destruction on the U.S. homeland. These would be catastrophic consequences for the United States. So right off the bat, the position is, although we prefer Taiwan to be outside of the effective administration of Beijing, we need to do a cost analysis of U.S. intervention in a potential cross-strait conflict. I hate to break it to the people who understand the world through emotions rather than fact, but U.S. intervention has always been about maintaining the interests of the U.S. ruling class. It's not about, benevolence or anything like that. So the choice the U.S. would have to make in the event of war between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland is whether to intervene with no guarantee of victory at a great cost of wealth and human lives, or to pursue another option. And so far, we can assume that the authors are going to propose other options. And so the authors state that U.S. leaders need a way to escape the ghastly decision to either wage World War III or watch Taiwan go down. They need a third option. And this third option is some sort of plan that enables Taiwan to mount a viable defense in the event of a cross-strait war. Lets the U.S. assist from a distance while also maintaining U.S. geopolitical interests in the Asia-Pacific, regardless of how the conflict ends for Taiwan. So we can see that this article was a call by defenders of U.S. hegemony against a direct military confrontation because of the Taiwan issue. Direct military confrontation between the U.S. and China. They kind of don't really care about whether or not there's a military confrontation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Then the authors proceed to say, yet U.S. policymakers must also accept that without direct U.S. military intervention, Taiwan may manage only to stall a Chinese invasion, not repel one. The United States therefore needs to insulate its regional interests from Taiwan's fate. Instead of clarifying its commitment to defend Taiwan, Washington should retain an ambiguous stance and downplay the importance of keeping the island out of Beijing's hands. It should, meanwhile, bolster the self-defenses of its other Asian allies and partners, blocking any path for China to convert a successful bid for Taiwan into regional dominance. So, what does this mean? For decades, U.S. policymakers have viewed Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a strategic anchor in the first island chain positioned between the Philippines and Okinawa. Ever since it became clear that the communists would emerge victorious on the mainland, the thinking in Washington has been that if Beijing were to gain control of Taiwan, the island chain would be broken, giving Beijing unfettered access to the Pacific. Now, however, the authors are now arguing that instead of fixating on Taiwan as the linchpin, the U.S. should strengthen its ties with regional allies, so primarily Japan and South Korea, so that even if reunification occurs and Beijing takes control over Taiwan, America's broader position in the Asia-Pacific wouldn't be fundamentally threatened. The goal, in their view, is to offset whatever strategic advantage China might gain from reunification. The authors also criticized the framing of the Taiwan issue by some U.S. politicians who portray it as this sort of life or death matter for American survival or prosperity. While the authors do acknowledge that reunification would complicate U.S. military operations and allow Beijing to more easily disrupt key trade routes in the Western Pacific with global economic consequences, they still caution against overreaction. They note that in such a scenario, America's regional allies would understandably begin to question Washington's commitment to their security. But even then, the authors emphasize that the costs of U.S. military intervention in both lives and dollars would not be justified. And so they argue that even if Beijing were to reunify China by force, simply gaining control of Taiwan wouldn't automatically turn China into a hegemon. The U.S. would still be able to contain Chinese influence and prevent it from achieving political and military dominance in Asia. So what we're seeing here is classic zero-sum thinking, this kind of strategic calculus that's typical of defenders of U.S. hegemony. And it's also telling. It's never been about defending a so-called ally, but about the containment of a potential competitor to U.S. hegemony. The authors then get into what Beijing actually gains by controlling Taiwan. They state that, in theory, it could extend the reach of its missile systems, air defenses, radar networks, and maritime and aerial surveillance. The People's Liberation Army would be able to operate further from the mainland, putting U.S. military assets like bases in Guam and ships near Japan and the Philippines at greater risk. Then they note that the PLA's existing weapon systems can already target these locations, and that gaining Taiwan would only add a few hundred miles of range, which is, in their view, only a marginal improvement, but not a game changer. So the TLDR is any military advantage Beijing gains from having Taiwan under its control is marginal, and that the U.S. and its partners in the region have time to prepare additional defenses to address these gains. So far on the military front, it seems these foreign policy advisors are going out of their way to discourage U.S. policymakers from committing to the defense of Taiwan in the event of war. Instead, they argue that resources would be better spent adapting to the new strategic reality if Chinese reunification were to happen. But what about the economic front? And when we talk about the economic front, we're basically talking about TSMC, which produces roughly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. And their argument in this regard is really straightforward. TSMC relies heavily on Western components and intellectual property, and if Beijing were to seize control of the company, these resources would be cut off. On top of that, the U.S. is already preparing for the possibility of losing access to Taiwan-made chips by pressuring TSMC to build fabrication plants in Arizona. And the thing about chips is they're not oil fields. You can't relocate oil reserves, but you can move chip production. So what I really appreciate about this article is that unlike many Western journalists who dress things up with feel-good rhetoric about defending democracy or standing by allies, these two authors completely drop the facade. They're refreshingly honest about what U.S. foreign policy ultimately revolves around, which is maintaining U.S. hegemony in the least costly way possible, whether we're talking about dollars, effort, or human lives. Now, I'm well aware that the more hawkish defenders of U.S. hegemony will be quick to label the authors of this article as soft leftists, insisting that the U.S. must ramp up its support for the Taiwan administration. But let's take a closer look. The authors aren't actually opposing US involvement per se. They're not against arming Taiwan. They're just against putting American boots on the ground. In other words, they're perfectly fine with using the people on Taiwan as cannon fodder. To illustrate this point, I'm going to read the following suggestion they make. To make a Taiwan-led US-supplied defense viable, the United States should adopt two policies over the next decade. Insist that Taipei reorient and step up its defense efforts and improve the Pentagon's ability to send military supplies to Taiwan during a conflict without putting Americans in harm's way. Specifically, the authors argue that Taipei should be required to raise its defense spending from about 2.5% of the GDP to at least 4% by 2030. And this gets to the heart of a very real and pressing debate on the ground here in Taiwan today. The Trump administration is calling for Taipei to boost its military spending to up to 10% of its GDP and is openly saying that Taiwan is currently not in a position to defend itself in a Cross-Strait conflict. This is one of those things that people kind of knew all along, but wanted to stay in denial about. So in that sense, it's actually quite significant. And this is why, despite Trump's disastrous trade policies, which do seem likely to hurt the average American family since everything's made in China, I still view Donald Trump as the so-called harm reduction candidate of 2024, if we're using liberal terminology. Because a lot of times he says the quiet part out loud, and in doing so, forces the rest of the world to confront the realities of US imperialism. And on the topic of his tariffs, they seem to be serving as a wake-up call, reminding countries around the world, especially China, to not put all of their economic eggs into one American basket. Now, the DPP administration, led by Xiangyu, has seized on this narrative to stoke fear, falsely accusing the opposition majority legislature made up of the KMT and the TPP, or the Taiwan People's Party, of cutting the military budget to serve the interests of the CPC. But here's the reality. Taiwan's current military budget is already the highest it's ever been. And while the opposition did reduce the proposed increase, the cut was actually smaller than similar reductions made in previous years when the DPP held a legislative majority. I mean, go figure. The authors argue that right now, Taiwan's defense strategy isn't actually built to handle a real attack from the mainland. They point out that the government spends a lot on high-end weapons like F-16 fighter jets, Abrams tanks, and submarines, which are, impressive sounding equipment that's meant for direct combat. But the problem, they say, is that Taiwan can't win a head-on fight with the mainland. And that, big systems like these, F-16 fighter jets, Abrams tanks, submarines, are easy for the People's Liberation Army to detect and destroy early on. And even if a few survive, the mainland's much larger military would likely overwhelm them pretty quickly. In that case, Taiwan would be left with very little defense, relying entirely on the hope that U.S. warships and fighter jets show up in time. And I don't think U.S. warships and fighter jets will show up, ever, not even late. And so they suggest that the U.S. should cancel all unfulfilled orders of these ships and fighter jets, and that Taiwan should shift to what many analysts call a porcupine strategy. So a porcupine strategy is like a strategy that's focused on making the island much harder to attack. And this means moving away from, flashy conventional weapons and instead building up cheaper but highly effective defenses like, sea mines, anti-ship missiles, and mobile air defense systems. These porcupine tools are designed to delay or block an invasion, potentially dragging the mainland into a long, costly conflict that could create an opening for a political solution rather than a swift military takeover. Then the article notes that both the Trump and Biden administrations have pushed Taiwan in this direction, and that Taiwan has started to make these changes, like investing in anti-ship missiles and building small drones. But the authors still stress that progress so far has been slow and not nearly enough to really make a difference. And they even stress that Washington should make Taiwan a priority recipient of arms sales and prioritize Taipei's orders before those of other clients. Like I said, some people might think these authors are being soft on China or whatever, but they're really not. They're just being brutally realistic about the situation, and what they're proposing is a policy that lets the US milk Taiwan for everything it's worth before reunification happens. Think about it. Pushing Taiwan to raise its defense budget and buy even more weapons from the US gives Beijing a reason to ramp up its military vigilance. That leads to more drills and flyovers, which raises tensions across the strait. Then the DPP points to those tensions to stir up fear and justify even more arms purchases, feeding right back into the cycle. This will just keep escalating until someone crosses a red line and Beijing finally takes action, after we spend all of our tax dollars preparing for an unwinnable war. Let's be real. Any political solution to the Taiwan question will likely involve reunification. So we're basically looking at two paths. Either we maintain the status quo and gradually move towards peaceful reunification down the line, or we provoke conflict, shatter the status quo, and end up with reunification through war or surrender negotiations. If we're being sensible, the goal should be to promote dialogue across the strait. If the DPP wants to provoke conflict, fine. But the US should not be stepping in to fan the flames. Yet instead of encouraging talks, the policy being proposed would embolden the DPP, although admittedly, this is the most profitable path to take from the perspective of the US government. The best case scenario is it stretches out the status quo while making things more tense, and these deals keep lining up the pockets of the US military-industrial complex and politicians who get kickbacks. But the worst case scenario is it breaks the status quo and forces reunification under the worst possible terms for Taiwan. A more responsible and pro-dialogue approach would preserve the status quo and lower tensions, paving the way for a future reunification that both sides could actually live with. But obviously, that's not what Washington wants. If I haven't made it clear enough, the proposals of these two authors are clearly designed to benefit the U.S. establishment while throwing the Taipei administration under the bus. And worst of all, put the lives of the people in Taiwan at risk. This is exactly why I keep saying the people who support Taiwan separatism and push for deeper ties between Taipei and Washington aren't really pro-Taiwan. They're pro-U.S. hegemony, even if it comes at the expense of the people living on the island. If you truly love Taiwan and the people on the island, would you encourage the people to keep throwing their money away and prepare for the possibility of becoming cannon fodder? Back when Washington still had formal diplomatic ties with Taipei, before switching recognition to Beijing, there was the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, and that treaty guaranteed U.S. military intervention if Taiwan came under attack. But it's important to remember that at the time, Taipei had air and naval superiority over the mainland and was actively enforcing a blockade, so the chance of a large-scale conflict breaking out back then was relatively low. But when the U.S. shifted recognition to Beijing, part of the deal was that this mutual defense treaty would expire 1 year later, and all U.S. military bases on Taiwan would be removed. So ever since 1980, there hasn't been any mutual defense treaty. Instead, the U.S. passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which says that, cross-strait peace is a matter of grave concern for Washington. And that gave the U.S. domestic legal cover to keep selling weapons to Taiwan even after recognizing the PRC and publicly acknowledging the One China policy. And that's how this long-running tradition began, which is the U.S. selling overpriced and outdated weapons to Taiwan. Before the switch, a lot of this military aid was free. But after 1980, it became a business. And alongside the weapons came the illusion that the U.S. would still defend Taiwan in a war, despite there being no legal obligation to do so. I said this before on other platforms, but it's worth repeating. Nowhere in the Taiwan Relations Act does the U.S. make any commitment to defend Taiwan in the event of war. All it says is that any attempt to determine Taiwan's status by non-peaceful means would be considered a matter of grave concern. And U.S. lawmakers are fully aware of how non-committal that language is. In fact, former Senator Charles H. Percy once proposed changing grave concern to security interests to make the commitment clearer. But that amendment was shut down because it would have meant the U.S. would be obligated to go to war with China if cross-strait tensions escalated. Even top officials have said the quiet part out loud in the past. I mean, senior Pentagon official Edward Ross once put it very bluntly, as the lone superpower, our interests are plentiful and our attention short. We cannot help defend you if you cannot defend yourself. So, yeah. Back to the article. The authors go on to talk about how, although conscription's been extended back to 1 year for men born in 2005 and after, a lot of the training is still focused on basic military skills rather than advanced field exercises that would prepare soldiers for fighting in an actual war. So the authors recommend that the Trump administration pressure Taipei to lengthen conscription to 2 years. Back in the day, military conscription in Taiwan used to last 2 to 3 years, and then eventually it was standardized to 2 years for everyone, then gradually shortened to just 1 year. Later on, the government decided to phase out full conscription altogether for men born in 1994 and after, who would only be required to do 4 months of basic training, with the rest of the military made up of voluntary enlistees. But the problem was recruitment numbers kept falling short, and as Cross-Strait tensions started rising again under the Taiwan administration, the government ended up deciding that full conscription was still necessary. Now, the rumor at the time was that the U.S. was actually pushing for a return to 2 years of service, but since replacing 4 months of training with a full-length conscription period would have been widely unpopular, especially with a generation that was about to start voting, the Taiwan administration settled on 1 year as a compromise. To make it more palatable, they also promised higher pay for those affected by the new policy. So this article, like with the whole proposing 2 years thing, kind of confirms the rumors that were on the ground. The funny thing is, the article then continues, Taiwan should become as self-reliant as possible, but the United States may still need the capability to replenish Taiwan's military stockpiles during a Chinese blockade or under Chinese fire without bringing U.S. forces into the conflict. And so they're talking about how Taiwan should build up military infrastructure on Taiwan's eastern coast so that it can receive cargo during a war via uncrewed military transport systems that would allow the U.S. to supply Taiwan with weapons during a war and not suffer casualties if fired upon by the PLA. I mean, what the fuck kind of self-reliance is this? And also, if you watch my episode on the Joint Sword 2024B military drill from October last year, the PLA's main strategy in the event of war isn't to outright attack the island, but to enforce an impenetrable blockade, just like how Emperor Kangxi enforced a blockade around Taiwan during the Qing dynasty to force the Ming loyalist Rum state to surrender. Now, since these authors are ruling out direct military intervention, then it really is just a cash grab, like I said. Now, this part is very interesting, and I quote, the United States has also erred by expanding its military bases close to China and Taiwan. What they mean is the Chinese mainland and Taiwan. They're both part of China. Washington has tried to gain more military access along the so-called First Island Chain, which encompasses the seas closest to the east coast of mainland China. The United States has also pushed increasingly powerful military hardware in greater quantities close to Chinese shores. Washington would be better served instead by reinforcing existing infrastructure where it is most defendable. The U.S. military should enhance airfields and ports, logistics and supply hubs, and pre-position military equipment in northern rather than southern Japan, and along the so-called Second Island Chain, including Guam, the Marshall and Northern Mariana Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. China has fewer of the longer-range missiles needed to hit these distant and dispersed locations, making them more secure. By helping partners develop their own asymmetric defenses and protecting the U.S. military presence at better defended bases farther from mainland China, the United States can both deter Beijing from widening a conflict over Taiwan and prevent it from achieving regional hegemony in any scenario, including if it gained control of the island. You know what's interesting? The U.S. actually has been reducing the number of soldiers present in Okinawa and has been moving them towards places like Guam. So not only is the writing on the wall that the U.S. will hang Taiwan out to dry in the event, of a war, it's also no longer viewing the First Island Chain as strategically significant as it once did. Which is objectively true when the PLA's naval and air capabilities are increasing rapidly. And the First Island Chain was significant back when the PLA was weak in these areas. The authors then go on to suggest that the Trump administration should adopt a less provocative stance on the Cross-Strait issues than that of the Biden administration. They highlight how the Biden administration has taken a looser approach to interpreting the One China policy, contrasting it with past Sino-American relations that remained more stable precisely because the U.S. refrained from directly challenging that policy. The most significant departure occurred in 2022 when Nancy Pelosi visited Xiangyu, making Nancy Pelosi the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit the island in 25 years. Additionally, President Biden stated on 4 separate occasions that he would order U.S. forces to intervene if a cross-strait war were to break out, which is a significant shift from the traditional position of strategic ambiguity. Whereas previous presidents expressed support for Taiwan's democracy while explicitly opposing Taiwan independence, Biden on 2 occasions said that it was up to the people of Taiwan to decide whether or not to declare independence. But then he did later walk back on those remarks and reaffirmed that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. So, yeah. So why are the authors saying that the Trump administration should take a softer tone on China? And I think the answer is simple. What the authors of this policy paper want is to maintain a certain amount of tension, but also prevent a war. But like I said, in a way that would allow the U.S. to keep making lots of money from weapon sales to the island while backing away from any implied commitment to Taiwan. Instead of selling the illusion that the U.S. would probably intervene if Taipei bought weapons from the U.S., they're now proposing that the U.S. should sell the illusion that it's hardening Taiwan's self-defense capabilities so that Taiwan alone can fend off an attack from the PLA and prevent a full-scale advance onto the island. This article ends with the conclusion that U.S. policy on Taiwan has become too much of a centerpiece, almost as if Taiwan is running the show in terms of America's overall strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. And so the authors think Trump should take a step back and bring America's Taiwan policy back in line with the broader regional picture. So for one, they suggest building on the Biden-Xi meeting from late 2023 by doubling down on the One China policy. Not scrapping support for Taipei, but being more careful and consistent about it, which means going back to being vague about whether the U.S. would actually defend Taiwan if the PLA attacked, while at the same time discouraging any moves by Taiwan towards declaring independence. Also important is that they think the U.S. should pull back a bit on the growing number of official contracts and military trainers the U.S. has been sending over here to Taiwan. And I want to add that I personally saw some of this increased contact with my own eyes. I did my conscription last year at the training center of Taiwan's fire agency. And during my year there, U.S. military staff came on multiple occasions to discuss matters of civil defense that involve our fire and rescue infrastructure. And we weren't supposed to take pictures of them or talk about them visiting, but it was a pretty obvious open secret what was going on. The authors of this article also float the idea of giving Beijing quiet assurances, like reiterating that the U.S. will not support Taiwan independence unless Beijing starts a war. And if a reunification ever did happen peacefully and voluntarily, the U.S. would also accept that. Now, once again, some people worry this kind of approach might make the U.S. look weak and could tempt Beijing to act. But the authors argue that we can still keep Beijing guessing. The U.S. can still keep Beijing guessing through a strategic ambiguity. Basically, don't say yes or no, just let the possibility of U.S. intervention hang in the air. Combine that with continuing to rip Taiwan off with a bunch of weapon sales, and you actually keep deterrence strong, is their line of thinking. Thing is, I don't believe this strategy makes deterrence stronger, more so than it gives Beijing less justification for ramping up military actions towards Taiwan. They also push back against this fear that if Taiwan gets too strong militarily, Beijing might invade sooner to stop it. Realistically, at least according to the authors, Taiwan's not going to get so powerful that Beijing sees its window closing forever. And even if Taiwan becomes more of a porcupine, that's still not enough to stop the PLA if it's dead set on coming in. More likely, the Chinese mainland will just improve its own military rather than rush into war. So, I mean, this is them point blank admitting that they want to reduce tensions just to the point where war isn't imminent, but maintain sufficient tensions to justify an increased defense budget on Taiwan, which translates to more weapon sales to Taiwan. So I must say, if I ever own a car dealership, I want Jennifer Kavanagh and Stephen Wertheim to be on my sales team. Another big point of the conclusion of this article is about tone, especially at home in the US. Kavanagh and Wertheim think leaders need to stop hyping up the threat of war over Taiwan and that Americans deserve a clear-eyed conversation about what a war with China would really mean, which is tens or hundreds of thousands of American lives lost, possible nuclear escalation, a massive economic crash, way worse than 2008. Another big point of the conclusion of the article is about tone, especially at home in the US. Kavanagh and Wertheim think leaders need to stop hyping up the threat of war over Taiwan and that Americans deserve a sober conversation about what a war with China would really mean, which is tens or hundreds of thousands of American lives lost, possible nuclear escalation, and a massive economic crash, way worse than 2008. A war with China would not be like the smaller wars the US has gotten used to, like, Afghanistan, Iraq. This would be on a whole new level. And this I do agree with. I just think if the authors were responsible and wanted to benefit the US, and by that I mean the American people, not the establishment, they would propose that the US should stop meddling in cross-strait affairs completely and let, Taipei figure things out on its own with Beijing and work towards win-win cooperation with China. I mean, if you want to make Americans better off and not just line the pockets of politicians and the military-industrial complex, encourage BYD to sell consumer vehicles in America, but make them build factories in America and hire American, just like Tesla manufactures cars in China with Chinese workers. But at the end of the day, Kavanagh and Wertheim are just realistic and smart upholders of U.S. hegemony. I think they see the writing on the wall that U.S. hegemony is fading away, but their whole MO is to drag out this process and for the U.S. establishment to get as much out of places like Taiwan as it can before the rules of the game change forever. What they're basically saying all along is, Taiwan matters, but not enough to justify sleepwalking into disaster. Be firm, be smart, but don't overreact. The U.S. has more power and room to maneuver than it often gives itself credit for, and so the U.S. should not throw that away out of fear or political posturing. I mean, the most important thing here is that this is a huge slap in the face to the Lai Ching-te administration and its hardcore supporters, because now you got these U.S. policy advisors openly admitting a lot of the things that people like me and others have been saying for years. These aren't new ideas in Taiwan either. I mean, Li Ao was saying this kind of stuff back in the 2000s. The difference is, back then, if you voiced these views, DPP supporters or outright Taiwan separatists would accuse you of being a CPC sympathizer, either real or imagined. But now they're hearing more or less very similar points straight from the mouths of American foreign policy experts. Over the past few years, as more and more people in Taiwan started questioning whether the U.S. would really defend the island if the PLA launched an attack, DPP-aligned media would rush to label those doubts as CPC disinformation. And sure, Chinese state media does in fact point out U.S. hypocrisy, but that doesn't mean their criticism is wrong. It doesn't erase the very real concerns people have about whether the U.S. is truly reliable. Just look at Ukraine. The U.S. egged Russia on with a hardline stance, knowing full well what kind of reaction it might provoke. Then once the war began, they funneled in weapons while Zelensky sent waves of Ukrainians to their deaths. And now as the war drags on, the West is slowly backing away, just like many of us predicted. I think Taiwan actually got incredibly lucky amid all of this global tragedy. The war in Ukraine wasn't unprovoked, and it's not hard to understand why Russia acted the way it did. But that whole disaster could have been avoided, and countless lives on both sides could have been spared if U.S. foreign policy had been less arrogant and less blind to reality. And in the aftermath, it feels like at least some corners of the US foreign policy establishment are starting to wake up. They're trying to rethink their approach, not because they suddenly care about Taiwan, but because they know their credibility is on the line with so-called allies around the world. As is often said, lies have speed, but the truth has endurance. So that's it for today. If you have any questions about the information covered in this episode or anything else, or if you got anything you'd like to add, please leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. And as always, if you got any feedback or show suggestions, feel free to send them to straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. If you'd like to support my work sharing perspectives from this part of the world, stories you don't often hear in mainstream media, please share with your friends on social media and elsewhere, as well as subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you truly value what I do and want to go one step further and have the means to do so, consider becoming a patron on Patreon, joining as a YouTube member, or making a one-time donation using any of the links in the show notes. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you guys in the next episode.